On a Thursday in October 1924, a man named Ernest Olgert started seeing things. He worked at a Standard Oil refinery in Bayway, New Jersey. By Friday, he was running through the lab screaming that three figures were coming for him. His workers held him down, and on Saturday, he was taken to the hospital in a straitjacket. He died on Sunday. Within the week, 4 more men from the same building were gone. Dozens more were in hospital. The workers had a name for the building, and they had it for a while, well before anyone had passed away in it. They called it the Looney gas building. 5 days after the last man passed away, the chemist who invented what these workers were making held a press conference. To understand why 5 men died in New Jersey, you have to understand knock. In an internal combustion engine, fuel is supposed to burn in a controlled sweep after the spark. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it detonates early on its own and slams against a piston that's still coming up. That's knock, and it sounds exactly how it sounds like. Metal being hit. Knock put a ceiling on the automobile. You couldn't raise compression, and compression is where efficiency lives. Solve knock and every engine on earth gets better overnight. In 1916, this was the most valuable unsolved problem in automotive engineering. Charles Kettering ran research at General Motors. He handed the problem to a mechanical engineer named Thomas Midgley Jr., who spent most of the decade working through the periodic table more or less by brute force. He tried iodine, he tried aniline, he tried selenium compounds that made him smell so horrific that his wife refused to sleep next to him. And in December of 1921, he found it, tetraethyl lead. I want to be fair here because the story doesn't work if the invention was stupid. Obviously it wasn't stupid. Tetraethyl lead is genuinely an elegant piece of chemistry. At 1 part in 1,000, it suppresses knock almost entirely. Nothing else came close at that dose. Midgley solved the problem. The trouble is what he solved it with. In 1923, General Motors and Standard Oil of New Jersey formed a company to sell it. Neither had chemical plant experience, so they hired DuPont to actually make the stuff. And Kettering, he picked the name. They called it ethyl. Not leaded gasoline, not tetraethyl lead, ethyl. In every advertisement on every pump for the entire commercial life of the product, the word lead never actually appears. Lead poisoning was not some obscure frontier of science in 1923. The Romans knew. Benjamin Franklin actually wrote about it. There were laws about lead paint in Europe. Everyone involved in that decision knew what the word would do to sales, and they made a conscious decision to make sure that nobody ended up reading it. By the time Ernest Olgert died, the people making tetraethyl lead had already watched it kill their workers twice at 2 other plants owned by 2 other companies. DuPont built the first production facility at Deepwater, New Jersey. The first worker died there in September 1923. More than a year before Bayway, 3 more workers died through 1924, 4 more the following winter. The men who worked there called it the House of Butterflies, not because it was pleasant, obviously, come on, they're making lead, but because of what they saw when the vapor got into them, insects on the skin, on their clothes that weren't there. General Motors also had a facility in Dayton, Ohio. In April 1924, 2 men on the bottling line died. The line ended up shutting down. Bayway opened in September 1924. It ran for about 6 weeks, and 5 men had already passed away and dozens were sent to the hospital. And then that was shut too. 3 plants, 3 companies, everybody in the industry and nobody outside of this industry. What broke it open was actually a newspaper. They heard the phrase the Bayway workers used, Looney gas, and put it on the front page and started a campaign. This wasn't a regulator, this wasn't a health department, it was barely a newspaper, this was a tabloid which was running the words of the men who were dying. And when I say they knew in 1924, understand what I'm claiming. I'm not saying they should have suspected, I'm saying that they already had bodies proving this. On October 30th, 1924, Thomas Midgley sat down with reporters in New York to explain that tetraethyl lead was actually completely safe. He'd even brought a demonstration to prove the same. He took a container of tetraethyl lead, put it over his bare hands, and he let it run through his fingers. Then he picked up an open bottle, held it under his nose, and ended up breathing the vapor in for a full 60 seconds while the reporters watched and counted. Then he put the bottle down and told them that he could do that every single day and he would never come to harm. But here's the thing. 9 months earlier, Thomas Midgley had been in Florida. He had been sent there to recover. He'd spent months away from the lab, in the sun, being treated for severe lead poisoning that he had contracted from his own compound. He knew what it did because it had already done it to him. He knew the exact shape of that illness from the inside, and yet he stood in front of a room of journalists days after Feynman died of it and performed as a man who had nothing to fear. Shortly afterwards, he was diagnosed with lead poisoning yet again and left for about a year. Now, watch what companies do, because this is the actual invention. The lead wasn't. On Christmas Eve 1924, 3 men went to see the Surgeon General of the United States, Charles Kettering from General Motors, Frank Howard from Standard Oil, DuPont's chief engineer, W.F. Harrington. They asked Hugh Cumming, oh God, I'm a child. They asked Hugh Cumming to hold federal hearings on tetraethyl lead. The industry asked to be investigated. Makes no sense, but here's the thing. They were 9 weeks past a body count and losing a newspaper war, and they worked out that a federal review they helped shape was a lot more cheaper than a scandal they couldn't control. Get the government to hold the inquiry, and whatever the government says becomes the last word. In May of 1925, ethyl pulled the product from the market voluntarily. 16 days later, 87 people gathered in Washington for the Surgeon General's conference. The strongest voice against it belonged to Alice Hamilton. She was a Harvard professor and effectively the founder of industrial medicine in America. She had spent her career walking into factories and documenting what they did to the people inside them. Yandell Henderson of Yale stood with her. And Hamilton's argument was not that she had proof of harm. It was a lot better than that. She said this is a poison with no established safe threshold. You're about to disperse it into the open air of every single city in this country, and once it's in the air, there is no mechanism on earth by which you can get it back. You cannot prove this is safe, and it is not reversible, so the burden should be yours. She ended up losing. The conference handed the question to Cumming and a committee of 7 experts due to report by the 1st of January. On January 19th, 1926, that committee found, and this is the phrase, no good grounds for prohibiting the sale of leaded gasoline. But they did add 2 things. They warned that the hazards might emerge later, and they recommended further study. That further study never ended up getting any funding. Sales resumed, and the following year, the Surgeon General set what was described as a limit: 3 cubic centimeters of tetraethyl lead per gallon. That number was the maximum refiners were using already. A ceiling built at the height of the roof restrains nothing at all. It was a sham. And in 1924, in the middle of all of this, Ethyl Corporation hired a doctor named Robert Kehoe as medical director. In 1930, Kehoe founded the Kettering Laboratory at the University of Cincinnati, the first university lab in America devoted to industrial toxicology. It was funded by General Motors, DuPont, and Ethyl. So charitable, you might think. He ran it until 1964 and consulted for about 8 years after that. So for roughly 40 years, almost half a century, the leading academic authority in the United States on whether lead was hurting people was paid by the companies making and selling the lead. Kehoe's principle was simple, and it's still with us. Show me the data, and until you can solidly prove harm, the substance is presumed safe and it stays on the market. The burden actually sits with the critics, he argued. Look at what that does. If the product is safe, the company looks rigorous and cautious. If the product is actually dangerous, proving that it is takes 20, 30, 40 years, and it sells the entire time. There's no outcome where the company loses. And Kehoe controlled a great deal of funding for exactly the research that could have produced the proof he was demanding. That's the real invention here, not the additive, it's the argument that he came up with. It took a man who wasn't looking for it to actually prove it. In the 1950s, a geochemist named Claire Patterson was trying to work out how old the Earth is, using lead isotopes in meteorites. He kept failing because his samples kept getting contaminated, so he built the cleanest laboratory that had ever existed just to get the lead out of the room. And in doing so, he noticed something nobody had been positioned to notice before him. The lead wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was worse. It was in the air, it was in the water, the dust, his own hands. It was everywhere. And when he worked out how much there should be naturally, the number he got back was nothing like the number he was measuring. He published in 1964. Modern humans, he showed, were carrying lead burdens far above natural, which was a direct contradiction of 40 years of Kehoe. The response, surprisingly, was actually immediate. Research contracts were refused, including from the US Public Health Service. A Caltech trustee, an all-executive, phoned the university president to demand Patterson be shut up. And in 1971, when the National Research Council convened its panel on airborne lead, they left off the single most qualified person alive on the subject. He was right. The phase-out began in the 70s, and on the 1st of January 1996, leaded fuel was finally prohibited for road vehicles in the United States, 72 years after Ernest Olgert. Though leaded fuel actually never went away entirely. It's still legal for aircrafts. There are piston engine planes flying over your house today burning leaded gasoline. Because for decades the argument was that nobody had proven the harm was worth the cost of changing. The lead was mostly gone. The thing Robert Kehoe built is not. Show me the data, prove it first, and until then, we will keep selling, we will keep making money. We do not care if the public suffers. That sentence has been used on tobacco, on asbestos, on PFAS, on carbon. It is being used on something right now, probably by someone who will be described in 70 years the way we described Thomas Midgley. They knew in 1924. And unfortunately, knowing was never the hard part.